For 5 centuries, historians have documented, studied, and praised Christopher Columbus. Then suddenly, starting in 1980, a horrible image of him appeared that wiped away 5 centuries of glory. Was this due to new historical discoveries? Were new facts uncovered about him that were previously kept secret? Had reputable scholars and students of history suddenly all agreed that he really was a monster? Well, the answer to each of those questions is an emphatic no. Yet, if you ask the ordinary person on the street about Columbus today, they may believe him a cruel tyrant, a rapist, a slave master. Even persons of Italian-American heritage have been heard to disparage him. Didn't he do horrible things to the natives, they ask? But contrary to current popular belief, Columbus was, and still remains, one of the greatest heroes and explorers, and yes, even defender of Native American culture the world has ever known. We have 5 centuries of solid proof for that. 5 centuries of scholarship. He is probably one of the most studied personages in all of history. But believe it or not, his 5 centuries of excellent reputation have been ruined not by scholars of history, but rather due to the extremely powerful and misguided influence of entertainment celebrities. Celebrities such as Matt Damon and many, many others. In 2021, the internet teems with websites bashing Columbus, but the truth can still be found in historical documents in your own local library. Young people, unfortunately, do not research any deeper than the internet when doing school projects. Going to a library and reading a book is work, but that is where the truth will be found. Now, Columbus's demise quietly began around 1980. Howard Zinn, a lifelong family friend of movie superstar Matt Damon, published a book called The People's History of the United States. As a self-proclaimed anarchist, radical, and follower of Marxist philosophy, Zinn wrote this book to accuse and attack every major American hero from Columbus to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to try to topple the American capitalist economic system. Matt Damon, an impressionable 10 years old at the time, absorbed every word of Zinn's beliefs without question. He had been fired from his professorship at Spelman College for his radical beliefs. When Damon had the chance to support his old family friend many years later, he very positively plugged Zinn's book in a scene from the 1997 blockbuster film Good Will Hunting. Sales of Zinn's book soared. It is doubtful that this third-class work of popular history would have ever been popular without the endorsement of Matt Damon. Zinn's work, which has been severely criticized by legitimate scholars at Stanford, Cornell, and many other prestigious universities, omits many facts and relies on poor scholarship. Professor Samuel Weinberg of Stanford University wrote that Zinn's work is built on secondary sources of questionable provenance, omission of exculpatory evidence, leading questions, and shaky connections between evidence and conclusions. In other words, Zinn left a lot of stuff out. Yet, this one man's faulty and cynical interpretation of American heroes swept across the nation like lightning, overturning centuries of truth in almost an instant. Such is the power of movies, celebrity, and the internet. Zinn quickly changed from being a disgraced scholar to being professor to the stars. As sales of his book rose, He was involved in many other media events and TV productions. In 2009, the History Channel aired the show The People Speak, which was produced by Josh Brolin. By the way, the History Channel pretends to be scholarly, but it truly isn't. The People Speak featured many stars reading passages from Zinn's book. They had been paid to do so, and their paid endorsement really meant quite a lot. In between these sequences of famous actors such as Marissa Tomei, Morgan Freeman, Benjamin Bratt, and others, very famous musicians such as Bruce Springsteen, John Legend, Bob Dylan, and others sang tunes. The overall impression was quite emotional and powerful. It appeared that these movie stars and music stars were finally revealing the real truth about American history, even though I really doubt that any of them had any training in historical scholarship at all. Unfortunately, good entertainment does not equate with good scholarship. Zinn became the Messiah to the downtrodden people of America. Statues of Columbus and other American heroes were desecrated. People demanded changes in school holidays. Many people swallowed Zinn's views of American history hook, line, and sinker. His use of celebrities to promote his so-called scholarship was remarkably successful. But his attack on traditional American history had a two-pronged approach. After gaining notoriety, he was invited to speak at the National Conference for Social Studies annual event for teachers. He realized the power that classroom teachers had, and the Zinn Education Project was founded on the wave of his popularity. Claiming to be the voice of the real truth in America's history, the Zinn Education Project succeeded in warping the views of many overworked teachers seeking ready-made lessons to fill their classroom time. Although traditional and legally approved curriculums around the country still presented the positive side of American history and American heroes such as Columbus, many middle school students returned home from school to shock their parents with horrible stories their teachers had told them about Columbus. In 2012, a major university asked readers of their History News Network to rate the least credible history books ever written. The People's History of the United States came in a close second, losing only 9 votes to a right-wing book on Jefferson. Nevertheless, it has become popular to desecrate and distrust traditional American heroes and beliefs. We should pause to remember that once most people on this earth believed in witches and witchcraft, and most people on this earth believed that the earth was the center of the universe and that all the universe revolved around it. In fact, the great scientist Galileo was attacked and punished by the Catholic Church for revealing that the earth revolved around the sun. Popular belief is not necessarily the truth. The reputation of Christopher Columbus is not the only issue. The totalitarian Big Brother government in George Orwell's masterpiece novel, 1984, controlled history by constantly changing past facts to suit their current political aims. If you read this great book, this was done by the so-called Ministry of Truth. Historical documents were constantly being modified and books rewritten. Howard Zinn asserted that the study of history was to create the future and that it was acceptable for the past to be refashioned to suit the present political need. Sounds quite like Orwell's nightmarish vision of the truth. It is obvious that Columbus has become the scapegoat for all the atrocities of the European invasion of the New World. Many things have been falsely attributed to him. All the injustices in the treatment of native peoples, all the terrors of slavery. You know, it is easier for the common person to focus hatred on one man than to realize the crimes of the past were committed by a multitude of persons. These atrocities were committed, no one doubts that. It is just a simple truth that Columbus did not commit them. These crimes were committed by thousands of unnamed people, soldiers, sailors, and soldiers of fortune, acting without Columbus's direction or control, and most importantly, long after Columbus left the New World. Yet Columbus has been made the symbol of European cruelty and domination of the indigenous people of the New World, facing the point of the spear of hatred. It is racist for an individual person to say, "I hate all white people, I hate all Europeans." But somehow that racism is hidden by saying, "I hate Columbus." For those who wish to know the truth, it can certainly be found. I recommend reading texts from the era of Columbus's discoveries. The first would be The Voyage of Christopher Columbus, Columbus's own journal of discovery, translated by John Cummins. Next would be two very influential works by a monk who actually accompanied Columbus on his last voyage. The first book is The Destruction of the Indies, and the second is The History of the Indies, both by Bartolomé de las Casas. It will become very clear to the reader that these works will exonerate Columbus of any of these false accusations. I also recommend that you watch my documentary entitled Columbus, the Dove Who Brought Christ, on the Italian America Long Island YouTube channel. A multitude of other texts and pamphlets are also available from many Italian American organizations, such as the Order Sons and Daughters of Italy in America. Upon reflection of the true facts and research, it becomes clear that the desecration of American heroes such as Columbus has only one purpose: to create racial tension and hostility. Celebrities have been used to manipulate the mass audience. Columbus has been made into the scapegoat that is guilty of all the sins, real and imagined, that have been perpetrated against the downtrodden. Simple minds seek simple answers. The truth, however, requires a level of sophistication that, unfortunately, many in our society lack. They would rather vent their hatred than find the truth. Lies and distortions about Christopher Columbus. Scanning the internet for postings and articles about Christopher Columbus, here are some of the lies and distortions I found. Some of these items were discovered on websites that looked and seemed very believable. Let's start with a simple one. According to a website on the internet, quote, Columbus did not discover America. In 1493, Columbus brought news of the New World back to Europe, which started what historians call the Age of Discovery. Many explorers from several European nations now had the courage to cross the ocean to find new lands. Eventually, Columbus's discoveries led to the great migration of millions of people to the Americas. While it is true that Leif Erikson had been to Newfoundland before Columbus, He kept his discovery secret. In fact, no one even knew Erickson had been to the Americas until the 20th century. Can you honestly call Erickson's secret travels discovery? Distortion number 2. Columbus was a conquistador. A typical Spanish conquistador, which means conqueror in English, set out to dominate new lands for Spain. Their purpose was the enrichment and broadening of the Spanish Empire, often using cruel and barbaric methods to achieve their goals. Their purpose was primarily political. Columbus's purpose was to bring Christianity to China and Japan, much the same as St. Francis of Assisi had traveled to Arabia to meet with Muslim people. Columbus's ships carried the sign of the cross on their sails, and his own name translates as the dove who brings Christ. In April of 1492, the Muslim Moors were finally driven out of Spain. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella believed that this was the perfect time to expand Christianity. They approved Columbus's expedition in hopes of expanding to the Far East. Columbus set sail in August of 1492, just a few months after the Moors had been driven out. This next item I found on the internet is one of the biggest lies I discovered, and it shows you how half-truths can be distorted to fit any political agenda. Distortion number 3. Quote, Columbus was a cruel tyrant who was imprisoned for the barbaric acts of torture he used to govern Hispaniola. While it is true that Columbus was sent back to Spain in chains after one of his voyages, it is also true that he was immediately released upon arrival. According to Bartolomé de las Casas, a monk who accompanied Columbus on his last voyage, the reason for his enchainment was quite different from what I found on the internet. De las Casas, in his book History of the Indies, explains that people from many different levels of Spanish society traveled on Columbus's voyages. The nobles, or hidalgos at the top of society, had never in their lives done manual labor. When food ran out on one of the expeditions to the New World, many of the manual laborers grew ill and died. The only food left was grain they had carried from Spain, but this was inedible until it was milled into flour. Columbus ordered a mill to be built, and he ordered that everyone, regardless of rank, participate in its construction. The task required hard manual labor under harsh conditions of heat and half-starvation, but it was necessary for their survival. De las Casas wrote in his book that this event so enraged the Spanish hidalgos against the Italian Columbus that they imprisoned him and sent him back to Spain. The arrogant nobles were so insulted by having to work, they never let go of their hatred for Columbus. De las Casas claimed this was the beginning of many lies and distortions to be told about him. Next, one of the most popular distortions about Columbus concerns the issue of slavery. Distortion number 4. Columbus enslaved the native people. Let's put this issue into perspective. In 1492, slavery was practiced the world over. In fact, it wasn't until 1863, almost 400 years later, that slavery was outlawed in the United States. At the time of Columbus's voyages, even the native tribes of the New World enslaved those they had defeated in battle. The Carib tribe had brutally murdered most male Arawaks, and they took their surviving wives and children as slaves. Columbus discovered this by noticing the women spoke a different language than the men. In a letter to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, Columbus detailed the riches of the New World he had discovered. He listed many natural resources, and he also included the possibility of many slaves, even though he personally did not enslave anyone. Ferdinand and Isabella wished to gain souls for Christ, so they rejected the idea of slavery for the natives. Columbus's detractors point to this one line in a letter to label him a slave master. In another incident, de las Casas documented that Columbus freed a young girl who had been taken captive by some of his own men working on their own. Columbus also gave strict directives that the natives were to be fairly paid for any item given to his men in trade. Columbus wrote in his log that the natives were among the best people he had ever encountered and praised them for their gentleness and kindness. He also befriended the native chief Guacanagari and directed his men to give the natives respect and love. In truth, the Spanish governors Bobadilla and Roldan, who arrived after Columbus, were responsible for taking advantage of the native people. Again, read de las Casas' works. Here is another outright lie that you may find on the internet. Columbus deliberately brought smallpox to the New World to kill the native people. He is guilty of genocide. Again, this is a half-truth that has been distorted. Many natives did die of smallpox, but the reason this happened has more to do with ignorance rather than deliberate evil. In 1492, no one in the entire world knew anything about the causes of disease, nor did anyone know anything about the science of immunology. Edward Jenner, the physician who invented the smallpox vaccine, died in 1832, and Louis Pasteur, who discovered the germ theory of disease, died in 1895. People of Columbus's time had no idea what caused disease or how to prevent it. The truth is that the people of the New World had never developed the antibodies necessary to combat the foreign germs unknowingly brought to them by Europeans. A little-known fact is that the native peoples unknowingly transmitted the germ of syphilis to the Europeans. The first recorded incident of syphilis in Europe occurred in 1493, and scientists and historians directly attribute this fact to the return of Columbus's men to Spain. Eventually, millions of Europeans died of syphilis. Ask any doctor. Different regions of the world favor different diseases. If Americans travel to certain parts of the world, appropriate vaccinations are recommended to prevent diseases not common in America. So as you can see, the claim that Columbus deliberately committed genocide is an outright lie. As Joseph Goebbels, chief propagandist for Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, said, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." It seems to me that so many lies and distortions have been spread about Columbus that people have actually come to believe them. The underlying question is, why would anyone do this? Why would anyone challenge 500 years of scholarship and investigation into a man's reputation? With the recent reports of Russian interference into our own American elections, it makes me wonder, who is posting so many inflammatory and egregious stories about Columbus? These allegations have certainly caused unrest and fired rebellious distrust of traditional American heroes and institutions. Have enemies of the United States corrupted the images of our heroes to weaken our nation? I urge anyone with an interest in truth to refer to what historians call primary sources. That is, those documents that existed at the time in question. With regard to Columbus, this would include the log of his voyages, and certainly the works of de las Casas. There are other documents available from his time, but they are much more difficult to find. Do your own research by going to a library. Seek, and you shall find the entire truth. As you can see, Christopher Columbus has been made the scapegoat for all the sorrows and troubles suffered by the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Anyone with a compassionate heart is sympathetic to the tragedies they have endured. But it must also be said that anyone with a mind capable of critical thinking should realize that you cannot remedy one injustice by creating others. By using the power of celebrities, Christopher Columbus has been falsely accused and presented as a monster to great numbers of people. When great numbers of people react emotionally, the result is mob mentality. And how many innocent people have suffered at the hands of mobs? Mob mentality uses anger rather than reason to direct action. Mob mentality has desecrated statues of Columbus. Mob mentality has demanded that Columbus Day be abolished. Mob mentality rushes to refashion historical truth and replace it with lies. Mob mentality creates more injustice. It is not a remedy for injustice. Certainly, the indigenous peoples of the Americas deserve recognition. Indigenous culture should also be celebrated. Ironically, Christopher Columbus would wholeheartedly agree with those statements. It has been suggested that an Indigenous Peoples Day be added to the federal calendar of holidays, and I agree with that. But to replace or abolish Columbus Day would be a terrible injustice to history, truth, and to Columbus. Despite whatever lies the mob may spread about him, Columbus was the man who undeniably opened the Americas to the rest of the world. He alone was the man who had the courage to prove the Atlantic could be crossed. His great accomplishments should not be and cannot be forgotten. It is right and just to honor him. It is right and just his statues should stand in many cities all over the world. It is right and just we honor him with the traditional celebration of Columbus Day. Seek the truth and speak the truth. Thank you for watching this program.